In episode 15 of Shield Hero, we were shown several flashbacks relating to Raphtalia's tragic past, starting with her normal life as a young girl raised in a small village, leading all the way up to the moments that she was taken in by Naofumi. However, this entire series of events was actually made into its own side story in the novels, one filled with more detail and more recounts of Raphtalia's past that allows us to understand better how she got to where she is as a character. So, in today's special episode of Cut Content, let's take a look at Raphtalia's backstory as told in the extra chapter called The Flag on the Kids' Meal. You can find this extra chapter in Volume 1 of the light novel and at the end of Chapter 8 in the manga. And just like the other extra chapters, like the one that covered the Hot Spring arc, this whole event will be told from Raphtalia's point of view. So, let's get started. In the beginning, we find ourselves pre-Wave 1, set in Raphtalia's remote village. It's a beautiful day, and we first see Raphtalia leaving her home to meet her friends at the town square, one of which was Keel. Once everyone was gathered together, they start to run towards the fields, competing to be the first ones there. Keel would always try to beat everyone else, but he could never beat Raphtalia because she was the fastest one. Now, they had always been told to be careful out in the fields since there were the occasional monsters that were lurking around. But up until this point, Raphtalia and the rest of them had never been in a dangerous situation, so it's not like they were always cautious to their surroundings. Anyway, once there, they start to play tag for a bit, and it's after Raphtalia tires herself out that she goes to sit with her friend Rafana. This was her best friend in the village, though she was much more girly than Raphtalia, and would prefer to talk about things like relationships and love rather than play games. So she would often talk about who they'd want to date or end up marrying when they grew up, eventually leading up to the question of who Raphtalia loved. At first she said her father, but after being told to choose someone her own age, Raphtalia had to contemplate on it for a bit. Ultimately, she decided on Keel. To her, he was the coolest one around, but she would never actually muster the courage to tell him that. You see, Raphtalia was actually quite insecure with herself. She was the type of girl to look in the mirror and be unimpressed with what she saw, never being satisfied with her own face. She compared herself to other demi-humans who were much more beautiful, and hoped to one day turn out like them. But she never actually truly believed that she would, since she knew her race wasn't known for being the most beautiful. Her mother, though, was always very supportive, constantly telling her that she'd definitely grow up to be a fine young woman. The question then gets shifted to Rafana, with which she responds by saying the Shield Hero. Her parents told her all about his kind disposition to the demi-humans, and this made her idolize him. But before she could say any more, as if in a brief flash, the sky tore open and turned into a deep red. Everyone looked up in awe, and Keel even wanted to stay and find out what it was. But Raphtalia had a feeling that something bad was about to happen, so she stopped him, and together they ran back to the village. Unaware of what was happening, Raphtalia rushes over to her father. He had just come back from talking to the governor, and he was told that everyone needs to prepare to fight because monsters would soon emerge from the cracks in the sky and start to attack the village. But before anyone could even start to prepare, monsters already began flooding the area. Now, normally, their village wasn't necessarily defenseless. Hunters were quite capable demi-humans, and there was even mention of a strong person named Sedina. However, she was nowhere to be found, and the hunters were out on a fishing expedition, so that meant that some of their most capable people wouldn't be there to help them with warding off the invasion. At first sight of the initial wave, many villagers began to panic. The skeletal soldiers slowly approached them, and people began to flee in terror. Raphtalia's father did not, though. He engaged first, casting First Holy, a magical ball of light that would deal direct damage to the skeleton and take it down. But that was just one of many enemies. There was far too many for any of them to possibly hope to take on. This left the villagers with only one option remaining: evacuation. Though some would have to stay behind and buy the others time to get a safe distance away. Both Raphtalia's mother and father decided to stay and hold the lines. Meanwhile, the rest of the villagers calmly made their way towards the ocean. Their thinking was that if they got into some boats and were surrounded by water, then surely the monsters wouldn't follow them. So that's where they headed. But before anyone could get too far, a massive three-headed beast appeared from the cracks, and it rushed with great speed towards the village. Raphtalia's father was the first to try to stop it, but it was too fast and too powerful. It evaded the incoming attack and it swiped at him, easily knocking him aside. When the villagers saw the strength of this beast, they began to panic once again. Many started to rush as fast as they could towards the ocean, and because Raphtalia was in the middle of this group, she was knocked over by the frightened mob. Her mother was able to quickly find her, and she jumped over her with a great hugging motion, as if to shield her with her own body. While this was happening, Raphtalia could see out of the corner of her eye this three-headed beast indiscriminately attacking all the villagers as they ran for their lives. All the while, she could only hear the soft voice of her mother, trembling as she repeatedly said that everything was going to be okay. Now, the beast must not have seen Raphtalia and her mother because it ran past them towards more of the fleeing villagers. It even chased after the ones that went into the ocean, and it was a much more capable swimmer than any demi-human in the water. The sea essentially became a feeding ground for the beast, and it started to turn red as the villagers' screams began to diminish from the distance. This was the moment Raphtalia's family could use to get away. Her father had managed to rejoin them, and he guided them away from the beast while it was occupied in the water. Though it wasn't long before the beast leapt back out, and it started hunting the remaining villagers. It was too late now. They could no longer flee or fight. They could only resist to the very end. The beast finally focused its attention on Raphtalia and her parents. It began to chase them, and it cornered them on the edge of a cliff. Down below, Raphtalia could see the remains of her fellow villagers. A few were left alive, but they were stranded in the ocean, and the current was too strong for them to return to shore. It was clear that they were going to drown soon. This brings us now to the flashback from episode 2. But there's a key line said by her parents here that wasn't shown in the anime. It's what her parents said in episode 15. How she should never forget to smile and always be nice to others. How she needs to be this beacon of hope to everyone else. Her parents saw her goodness, and they wanted her to strive to maintain it no matter what. That was their final lesson before pushing her off the cliff. Now, you might be wondering why they all didn't just jump off together. Well, that was because if her parents jumped too, then the beast would return back to the village and slaughter everyone else. Raphtalia's father wasn't about to let that happen. He knew what needed to be done, so he stayed and he fought. As Raphtalia hit the water, she tried to keep her head above the raging waves and see what was happening on the cliff, but all that she could make out was when the beast jumped at them. Everything after that was just a blur. Luckily though, she wasn't taken away by the current. She had managed to wash back up on shore, but by that time, the wave was over and night had already fallen. She slowly made her way back to the village and saw that there were a few survivors. More kids than adults, but survivors nonetheless. She then remembered her parents and rushed to the cliff where she last saw them, but all that was there was strips of flesh and the dead husk of the three-headed beast. You see, reinforcements had arrived and were able to take it down, but they had mentioned that if it wasn't already pretty beat up when they got there, then they likely wouldn't have been able to defeat it. As the adventurers and knights removed the dead beast from the cliff, Raphtalia slowly approached the very edge, only to find what was left of her parents. Needless to say, she didn't handle the grisly sight very well. We then have a time skip to when she had just finished making the graves for her parents. As she remembered their last moments, she gained solace in the fact that they died as heroes, giving their lives to save the other villagers, and she knew now what her parents wanted her to do. She believed that they had entrusted the ones they saved, the remaining survivors of the village, to her. So she decided she would be the one to show them the way, and do so with a smile on her face every step of the way so that their deaths wouldn't be in vain. It was here that Raphtalia also vowed not to cry anymore, for if she did, she felt it would make her parents upset. So she persisted. She rallied the villagers and told them that they needed to move forward. She even gave a speech that everyone found inspirational, and it was during this very speech that their village flag had fallen. You see, this flag was special. The late governor gave it to them as a symbol of the town and the people in it. It signified their independence. And as it fell right in front of her, Raphtalia took it as a sign that her parents were watching over her. So she grabbed the flag and attached it to a pole, raising it once more to fly above the village. And it stood there as the village's symbol of hope. While doing all this, Raphtalia wore a smile the entire time, though some found this strange as she was still this little girl who just lost her parents. They thought, how could she be so cheerful? Some asked her directly why she wasn't upset, but deep down she knew she was sad, but she also knew that she couldn't show it. Her parents said so. So Raphtalia carried on, forcing a smile through every interaction, though not the type of smile that would cheer you up when you saw it. This time, it was different. Regardless, everyone began to focus on rebuilding. There was only a quarter of the village population remaining, and mostly every house was destroyed. Not to mention that their food supply was now running low, and they had no great way of restocking it. Tents had to be set up, and rations needed to be distributed. Then, once all the logistics were sorted out, adults began to focus on rebuilding houses that were still somewhat intact, while the kids helped where they could. A few days pass, and every night Raphtalia would have the same dream. She would see her parents' death over and over again, causing her to wake up screaming out of fear. But that didn't stop her from still helping everyone else out. She remained this beacon of light that the village needed. As more time would pass, that's when the villagers started to notice that some sketchy-looking people had started hanging around the town. They were wandering around as if they had no purpose but to observe and give dirty looks to the demi-humans. When anybody made eye contact, they'd take out their swords and threaten them. A village elder decided to confront these men, saying the governor wouldn't accept this kind of rude behavior, but they didn't care. After all, the governor was dead, so it's not like anybody was upholding these demi-human rights. One of the men then took out his sword and cut down the elder who opposed him. Everyone began to panic as these men had revealed themselves to be the very soldiers that were sent to protect them. They decided that they were going to kill all the adults and keep the women and children to sell as slaves. Raphtalia tried to escape, but she was knocked out before she could get away, leading to her transition into slavery. She was sold to the slave trader, and after about a week with him, she was bought by her first owner. This owner was rather kind and only wanted Raphtalia as a servant, but after a few days, they ended up selling her back. Raphtalia never could figure out why that was, but we know that it was because of the noise she made during her nightmares. She then had a second owner, but that person ended up selling her back as well, which brings us now to her third owner, a fat man, a cruel man. This was the same person who also bought Raphana, but she had been a slave here for much longer. Every day he would chain them up, hang them from the ceiling, then beat them with a whip until they were covered in blood. Raphtalia even had a curse that would activate every time she tried to act like it didn't hurt. Cause remember, Raphtalia vowed to never cry. She would bear this pain for her parents and everyone who died in her village, just so that she wouldn't let them down. So she tried her best to stay strong for as long as possible. But the whip and the curse were driving her insane. It was the thoughts of returning back home with Raphana that kept her together, though the torturous cycle would continue with no end in sight. And because Raphtalia wouldn't show any pain, the sessions would only get worse and worse. She could only hope that the villagers would come to save them, or maybe even Sedina. If that was the case, then all they needed to do was survive. Unfortunately though, Raphana was getting sick. She could barely move from her bed and couldn't even eat. Raphtalia tries to comfort her whenever she can, but really there was not much that she could do. The last conversation that they were able to have together was about the memory of the flag and how it was their symbol of hope. It was later that night that Raphana would be found dead by the fat man. This really upset him, and he kicked Raphana's corpse in anger as he knew he had messed up. Meanwhile, Raphtalia hadn't registered yet what was going on. She could only wonder why they were being treated like this. Eventually, she did come to the realization that Raphana was now gone, and soon after that, she got her answer to her question. She saw that everything happening to them was merely for entertainment. Raphana's death combined with this revelation was the first step towards her being broken. The fat man then blamed Raphana's death on Raphtalia. He said that Raphana got sick because she could never sleep due to Raphtalia's constant crying throughout the night. Raphtalia didn't want to believe it, but the fat man made it seem as if it was so. He chained her up again and began to torture her, yet Raphtalia still didn't break. This made the fat man even more angry. He saw that physical pain just wasn't going to cut it. He needed to do something else. That's when he remembered that Raphtalia had always been talking about a village, so he went and got his crystal ball, projected an image of Raphtalia's village on the wall, and showed her the ruins of what was once her hometown. No one was left, no structure remained. It was now just a desolate landscape. That's when she saw the flag. It was in tatters and burned to the ground, and it was this image that finally broke Raphtalia. She felt she failed her village, her friends, even her parents. They entrusted her to guide the village forward, to protect it, but now it was gone, and so was everyone else. She was all alone, with no one to call friend and no place to call home. The pain was too intense to hold in anymore, and she finally began to cry. Crying in front of this evil man who was now grinning at her face. This made her nightmares worse because now that she had broken her promise, she believed that her parents were angry at her. She would see them telling her to die and to just give up. It even began to affect her sanity, resulting in the mental problems that the slave trader referred to back in episode 2. Eventually, the fat man would get bored of Raphtalia, and he would sell her back to the slave trader. Not only did she seem mentally unstable, but she also had the same sickness that Raphana did. She wouldn't have lasted long, if not for one day being noticed by a strange-looking young man. Yes, that man was Naofumi. We already know what Naofumi was thinking during these moments, but now we get to see what Raphtalia's initial thoughts were. As she looked up and into his gaze, she saw a man that was filled with hate, more hate than even the one that tortured her. It was as if he hated the whole world itself. She felt that if this man was going to be her new owner, then she would definitely be dead within the next few days. Once Naofumi confirmed his purchase, all Raphtalia could think of was that this was it. This would be her last owner. Surely this man was going to kill her. But after they left the slave trader's shop, she instead was bought clothes and handed a knife, then taken to a local shop to eat. She stared hungrily across the room at another kid that was eating, but she wouldn't dare ask for anything to eat out of fear of being punished. Naofumi could tell that she was hungry, so he bought her the cheapest meal on the menu. Raphtalia asks why he would do that, and he responds by saying that he needs her to be healthy. Raphtalia was confused because she still thought that she was going to die with this man, but now she wasn't so sure. She was still skeptical though. Perhaps this man would toss away her food the moment she tried to eat it, then laugh at her. For all she knew, everyone outside the village still hated her, so there was no reason to just trust this man. But when the food did come, he did nothing. He just watched and waited patiently for her to start eating. That's when she looked down at the meal. Sticking out the top was a small flag. She took it out and held it tight and began to eat. You see, the flag reminded her of her villages, and she felt that so long as she had it with her, then it would be as if she was back in the village. It was like it was a sign that her parents were watching over her again. Like she could remember all the warm memories from before this whole mess. Then, as she took bites out of her food, she began to cry at how delicious it was. And that's when she thought, perhaps things wouldn't be so bad anymore. Days would go by and she would continue to receive food and medicine from Naofumi. Her nightmares also slowly became different. Her parents were no longer angry at her. Instead, she would see them on that fateful cliff, leaning over her and patting her head, telling her that everything will be alright, saying that she'll be safe with this man. Then when she'd wake up with tears in her eyes, she'd see this man holding her hand or patting her head. She knew then that this man wouldn't hurt her. Sure, he was clumsy and rude, but deep down, she knew he was a nice person. It was only later that she found out that this was the shield hero. It was the shield hero who saved her, who fed her, who bought her all kinds of nice things. A girl who once was lost now had many things that she could call her own treasures. Everything that the shield hero bought her, she'd consider special. He eventually bought her a bag to use, which she then filled with all her treasures. This included a ball, a broken knife, and lots of other things. But most importantly, it carried the flag on the kids' meal. As the days continued on, she would think how surreal it was to be able to fight alongside the shield hero. She was now healthier and stronger, and could hold her own against enemies that scared her in the past. It was as if it was all a dream. Her nightmares would eventually pass too, and they'd soon turn back into dreams. Good ones at that. One night she saw Raphana, and she told her everything that had happened. They have the conversation that we see here in the anime. And when Raphana says that she would be watching over her, Raphtalia hopes that her parents would be too. She wanted them to see her use her new strength to make a difference, to fight against this cruel world that had taken everything away from her. She was given a second chance, and she would use that now to protect people, to protect Naofumi. Hope had finally returned to her. And yeah, that was Raphtalia's past. A story of personal redemption that intersects with Naofumi's, bringing us to the complementing storylines that we see in the anime. Both were victims to the corrupt system of the world that they were brought into, and both now seek to make a difference. Perhaps now you can view Raphtalia as this more dynamic character, one whose story actually has quite a bit of depth to it. And I think it'll be interesting to see how she further develops as the story goes on. But if nothing else, I do hope that you enjoyed this special episode of Cut Content. Now, before I go, I need your help in deciding where the future of the Cut Content series and just my videos in general will end up going. We're nearing the end of the season, and once Shield Hero has finished airing, it'll be time to move on to a new fantasy or isekai anime. So I've narrowed it down to 3 contenders that you can vote on. Danmachi Season 2, the more hyped upcoming isekai called From Commonplace to World's Strongest, or the lesser hyped but highly interesting other isekai with the mom and her multi-target attacks. And I guess I'll just throw in Isekai Cheat Magician, cause why not? But I think it'll come down to the first two options. They seem to have the more interesting source material. So go ahead and leave a comment on which you'd like to see in the future, as well as feel free to vote in the poll on my community page. Then we could see where things go from there. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!